I stood in the doorway of my children's rooms, but they weren't their rooms anymore. The walls that once held their drawings and photos were bare. The shelves that once carried bedtime stories and trophies now stood empty, stripped clean. And the laughter that used to live here was gone. My two kids stood behind me, clutching each other, eyes red from hours of crying. In the basement, cold, damp, and smelling faintly of mildew, their clothes and toys sat crammed into boxes. Boxes they never packed. Boxes they didn't ask to carry down those stairs. I turned to them, forcing my lips into what must have looked like a smile, though my heart felt like it was cracking in half. And I said, as evenly as I could, "Pack your bags." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even look toward the kitchen where I knew she was standing, smug, watching, believing she had just secured a victory. She thought this was over. She thought she'd taken something from me I could never get back. She thought moving my kids into that basement while I was lying in a hospital bed was the final move in whatever game she was playing. But it wasn't. It was the first move in mine. Even now, I can remember the faint scratch of the cardboard boxes under my fingertips, the sound of my kids' quiet sniffles, and the silence between us that said more than any words could. I glanced at the family photos still hanging in the hallway, photos she hadn't touched, and for a moment it almost felt like the house was holding its breath with me, because what was about to happen next would change everything. If this is your first time coming across one of our stories, welcome. Please hit the like button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And don't scroll away, because what happened next no one saw coming. And if you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. My name is Rebecca, I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of person who tries to hold a family together, even when it feels like the pieces are determined to break apart. I work as a high school guidance counselor in a small town in Indiana, a job that means listening to other people's children more than my own some days, but one I've always believed was important. My two kids, Emily, who's 12, and Noah, who's 9, are the reason I wake up each morning, and the reason I keep going when everything in me feels like quitting. Before everything happened, our life was not perfect, but it was ours. Emily loved to read in the little nook by her window, curled up with her blanket and a flashlight long after she was supposed to be asleep. Noah, my little inventor, was always taking apart remote controls and old radios, insisting he could make them better. I can still see his grin when one of his experiments actually worked, and Emily pretending to be annoyed, but secretly proud of him. We lived in a modest, two-story house with a yard just big enough for the kids to play tag in. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and it was home. 2 years ago, my husband, David, passed away unexpectedly. It was a car accident. One of those nights where the police at the door say everything you never wanted to hear in the shortest amount of time. The months that followed were a haze. I went on autopilot, packing lunches, getting the kids to school, showing up to work, all while something inside me felt permanently dimmed. That was when Melissa entered our lives in a more permanent way. Melissa is David's younger sister. She's 32, and at the time, she'd just gone through a divorce. She asked if she could stay with us for a little while, promising it would help me too since she could watch the kids while I worked. The arrangement made sense on paper. We both needed support, and I told myself it would only be temporary. First we managed. We were polite to each other. We weren't close, but there was no open hostility. She kept mostly to herself, and I appreciated that. Melissa's son Jake is 13, a year older than Emily. From the moment they moved in, it was clear Jake was used to getting his way. He had the biggest TV in the house set up in his room, shelves overflowing with video games, and a habit of rolling his eyes whenever anyone asked him to do chores. Still, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. He'd been through a lot too. His parents' divorce couldn't have been easy, and losing his uncle David must have hurt in its own way. Over time, though, little things began to surface. Melissa would make small comments at dinner like, "Jake could use a bigger room, he's growing so fast," or "It's hard for him to concentrate on homework with all the noise from downstairs." I brushed it off, thinking she was just venting. Emily and Noah never complained about Jake directly, but I noticed how Emily stopped spending time in the living room when Jake was there, and how Noah kept his projects tucked away in his closet. I kept reminding myself that we were a family, and families find ways to make things work. But then came the day that changed everything, the day my body reminded me it had its own limits. It started as a dull ache in my lower abdomen. I ignored it at first. I had work, the kids had school, there were bills to pay, and a million other reasons not to focus on myself. But by the end of the week, the pain had sharpened into something I couldn't push aside. I remember gripping the edge of my desk at school, forcing a smile as a student told me about their college acceptance letter, while every muscle in my body was screaming. That night, I collapsed in the hallway after putting Noah to bed. Emily's voice trembled as she called Melissa, who in turn called 911. By the time the paramedics arrived, I was barely conscious. At the hospital, I learned my appendix had ruptured, and the infection had spread. I needed emergency surgery, followed by days in the hospital to recover. Lying there, tethered to machines, the sterile smell of the hospital surrounding me, I told myself the kids were in good hands. Melissa had promised to watch them, and though we weren't close, I believed she'd keep them safe and comfortable. I didn't have the strength to think otherwise. For the first few days, she called to give me quick updates. "They're fine," she'd say. "Don't worry, focus on getting better." But as the days passed, her calls grew shorter and then stopped altogether. When I called the house, sometimes no one answered. When I asked if the kids could visit, she told me they were busy with schoolwork or tired. Her voice always had a certain edge, like she was cutting the conversation short. Then one night, half asleep in my hospital bed, I woke to the sound of muffled voices in the hallway. My door was slightly open, and I could hear Melissa's voice on the phone. I couldn't make out everything she said, but one sentence cut through the fog in my mind. "Jake will finally get the space he deserves." I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. I didn't know exactly what she meant, but it filled me with a cold, uneasy feeling. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that I was just tired and overhearing things out of context. But deep down, something told me that when I went home, things wouldn't be the same. If you told me then that the person I was trusting to care for my children was already making moves to push them out of their own rooms, I wouldn't have believed it. But I would soon learn that while I was fighting to heal, Melissa was making sure she and her son came out on top, no matter what it cost me or my children. And when I finally walked back through that front door, I would see just how far she had gone. The days in the hospital blurred into one another, a mix of bright fluorescent lights, the faint scent of antiseptic, and the steady rhythm of machines keeping track of my every heartbeat. The 4 in my arm fed me fluids and medication, its slow drip the only thing that seemed to move at a steady pace in that room. Every so often, the heart monitor would let out a soft beep, as if reminding me that time was still passing, even if I couldn't see the sun from my bed. Melissa had been the one to insist she'd take care of everything at home. "Don't you worry about a single thing," she'd said before I was wheeled into surgery. I wanted to believe her. She was family. She was living in the house. It made sense that she'd step in for me while I couldn't be there for the kids. The first couple of days after surgery, I felt a small sense of relief when she called. She told me the kids were fine, that Emily was working on a school project and Noah had been building something out of an old lamp he found in the garage. Her updates were short but reassuring. I pictured them safe, warm, and cared for. That image helped me sleep through the dull ache that never quite left my side. But slowly the calls began to space out. A whole day would pass without hearing from them then too. When I called the house, sometimes the phone rang and rang before anyone picked up. And when it did, it was usually Melissa, her voice clipped, telling me the kids were busy or resting. I asked if they could come visit, but she always had a reason why they couldn't: homework, the weather, not wanting to interrupt my rest. I told myself she meant well. Maybe she thought I needed quiet to heal. Maybe she was just overwhelmed with the responsibility of 3 kids and a house to run. But a small part of me began to itch with worry. I miss my children's voices, their laughter, even their squabbles. At night, lying in that bed, I'd close my eyes and try to imagine what they were doing, but lately the picture in my mind felt less certain. One evening, after a particularly restless day, I asked a nurse if I could take a short walk down the hallway. My stitches pulled with every step, but I was tired of staring at the same 4 walls. I moved slowly, gripping the 4-pole with one hand, the soft swish of my hospital gown against the floor the only sound I made. As I turned a corner near my room, I heard a voice. Familiar. Sharp. I froze. It was Melissa. She was standing near the end of the hall, her back to me, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, but the hallway carried sound in a way that made every word clear. "I told you it's just temporary," she said, her tone impatient. "Jake will finally get the space he deserves. They'll be fine downstairs." My breath caught in my throat. The words were plain, but their weight was crushing. Space he deserves? Downstairs? My mind immediately went to the basement. The cold concrete floor, the draft that always found its way in during winter, the smell of dampness that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. I stepped back, careful not to let the wheels of the four-pole squeak. She didn't know I was there, and I wasn't about to reveal myself. My heart pounded in my ears as I returned to my room, every step heavier than the last. Lying in bed, I replayed the conversation over and over. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. Maybe she was talking about a guest room, maybe she meant a study area. But deep down, I knew what she was doing. She was moving my children out of their own bedrooms, and she was doing it while I lay here, unable to stop her. I thought of Emily's little reading nook, of the way she arranged her books by color, of the glow of her lamp at night when she thought I didn't know she was still awake. I thought of Noah's desk upstairs, cluttered with tools and scraps from his projects, the safe space where his ideas took shape. They had roots in those rooms, memories in every corner, and she was ripping it away. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, my hands clenched under the blanket, the slow beep of the monitor the only sound in the darkness. I realized then that my recovery wouldn't just be about my health. When I left this hospital, I would have to reclaim something much more important. And she had no idea what was waiting for her when I walked through that front door. The day of my discharge felt like the first breath after being underwater too long. The nurse wheeled me out into the crisp air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the sun on my skin. It was late afternoon, and the light stretched across the parking lot in warm gold streaks. I thought about my kids the whole ride home, how I was going to surprise them, how they would run to hug me, how everything would feel whole again once we were back under the same roof. I imagined Emily in her nook with her book, pretending not to hear me call her name. I pictured Noah in his room, tinkering with some half-finished invention, his hair sticking up in every direction. That image carried me all the way to my street, past the familiar maple tree at the corner, and the mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. When the car pulled up in front of the house, something inside me shifted. It looked the same, but I felt something off. Not wrong enough to name, but wrong enough to notice. The curtains upstairs were open, ones that were usually closed during the day. Melissa opened the door before I could knock, a wide smile on her face that didn't touch her eyes. "You're home," she said, like it was an obligation she had to acknowledge. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of laundry detergent mixed with the faint, sharp tang of fresh paint. My eyes scanned the living room. It was tidier than usual, almost staged. My kids weren't there. "Where's Emily? Where's Noah?" I asked. "They're upstairs," she replied quickly, glancing toward the staircase. "I'll get them." But before she could move, I heard footsteps, small, hesitant, coming down the stairs. Emily appeared first, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes darting toward Melissa, then back to me. Noah followed, clutching the sleeve of his sister's sweater, his face pale. They didn't run to hug me. They just stood there like they were waiting for permission. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice soft but sharper than I intended. Neither of them answered. Instead, Emily's gaze flicked upstairs again, then to the floor. My stomach tightened. Without another word, I started up the stairs, ignoring the pull in my abdomen with each step. When I reached Emily's room, my breath caught. It wasn't her room anymore. The pale yellow walls we had painted together last summer were now a flat grayish blue. Her bookshelves were gone, replaced by a sleek black desk with a gaming computer. The bedspread was dark, patterned with sharp geometric shapes. Nothing like the floral quilt Emily's grandmother had made for her. Posters of sports teams and video game characters covered the walls. And on the desk, in the center of the room that used to be hers, was a trophy with Jake's name on it. I stepped into the hallway and opened Noah's door. His room too was unrecognizable. The bright green walls he'd chosen because they reminded him of superhero colors were now painted the same dull blue. His Lego sets, his science kits, his little globe all gone. In their place, a second bed, another desk, more of Jake's belongings. It was as if my children had been erased. Behind me, Melissa's voice floated up the stairs. It made sense, she said, her tone casual, almost rehearsed. My son's older. He needs the space. Your kids are fine in the basement. I turned to face her. She was leaning against the banister, arms crossed, wearing that same smug smile. In that moment, I didn't speak. My eyes went past her to the staircase, where Emily and Noah stood silently watching. I walked toward them, crouched down so I was at their level, and asked quietly, "Is it true? Are you in the basement now?" Emily nodded, her lips trembling. "It's cold," she whispered. "And it smells funny," Noah added, his voice small. "There are bugs. We hear them at night." Something inside me hardened. I looked at their faces, the fear, the confusion, the way they seemed smaller than I remembered. I straightened up slowly, my hands steady even though my heart was pounding. Melissa was still watching me, expecting an argument, a fight, something she could twist into a reason to make herself the victim. But I didn't give her that. I turned to my children, kept my voice even and said, "Pack your bags." No one spoke. The air seemed to hold still. Emily's eyes widened slightly, and Noah's hand tightened around hers. Melissa's smile faltered for the first time. I didn't look at her again. I didn't need to. She had no idea that those 3 words were the beginning of something she would never forget. Months before all of this unfolded, before I ever set foot in a hospital bed, there had been signs, subtle at first, easy to dismiss if you weren't looking too closely. I remembered one Saturday afternoon in early spring, Melissa and I were sitting at the kitchen table. She'd been flipping through a catalog, sipping her coffee, and out of nowhere she said, "You know, Jake really needs a quiet space to study. That little room upstairs would be perfect for him. He's outgrowing his current setup." I didn't even have to think before answering. "That's Emily's room," I said plainly, not unkindly, but firm enough to leave no doubt. "She's happy there. She's got all her things just the way she likes them." Melissa gave a little shrug, one of those half-smiles that's supposed to look harmless, but I caught the flicker in her eyes. It wasn't just a suggestion. It was a seed she was planting. Over the weeks, she dropped more comments like that. Sometimes at dinner she'd say, "It's hard for Jake to focus with all the noise downstairs." Or, "You know, with the right space he could really excel." Always framed as concern for her son, never as an outright request, but the meaning was there. And every time I'd push back gently, changing the subject, thinking that would be enough to close the matter. It wasn't until much later that I learned the real picture. Melissa had been struggling financially for months, maybe longer. She'd lost her job at the insurance office after missing too many days. She said it was because of stress, but people in town whispered about something else. Gambling. There were rumors she'd been making trips to a casino 2 counties over, and losing more than she could afford. I didn't want to believe it, but pieces started to fit. The overdue bills in the mail that she tucked away quickly when I came into the room. The sudden selling of furniture she claimed she didn't need anymore. The night she asked to borrow money, just to get by until the end of the month. I had told her no then too because I knew if I started it wouldn't stop. At the time I thought her resentment was just about money. But I see now it was bigger than that. She saw my house, my children's rooms, the stability I'd fought to hold on to after losing David, and she wanted it. She wanted a piece of it for herself and for Jake, even if it meant taking it from my kids. Looking back, even the conversations I'd had with neighbors feel different now. Mrs. Green across the street once mentioned she'd seen Melissa carrying boxes upstairs one afternoon when I was at work. I'd brushed it off, assuming she was just reorganizing. Another time my cousin called to say Melissa had been telling people she was helping me transition to a different setup at home, so the kids could be more comfortable. At the time I didn't think much of it, but those were trial runs for her lies, ways to prepare the narrative for when she made her move. And then there were the whispers from my late husband's side of the family. One of his aunts had told me, half under her breath, that Melissa was feeling crowded living in the house, that she thought she deserved more space, considering she was helping me out. I had dismissed it then, chalking it up to family gossip. Now, I could see it for what it was, foreshadowing. What Melissa didn't know, and what I've always been careful about, was that I had taken precautions long before my hospitalization. After David died, I learned quickly that being unprepared could cost you everything. I'd met with a lawyer, drawn up documents, and made sure that the legal authority to make any real decisions about my home and finances was locked down tight. In fact, I'd given power of attorney to my lawyer, not to any family member, in case I was ever incapacitated. Every important paper, our mortgage, the will, the title to the house, was kept in a locked safe in my bedroom closet. Only I and my lawyer knew the combination. Melissa may have thought that moving my children's belongings into the basement was a victory, but she didn't understand the limits of her control. She could rearrange furniture. She could paint walls. She could try to rewrite the living arrangements in her head. But she couldn't touch the ownership of that house, or the decisions that truly mattered, not without going through me. Even so, I realized something chilling in that moment when I pieced it all together. She hadn't done any of this on impulse. She'd been laying the groundwork for months, testing boundaries, weaving her story into casual conversations so it would seem reasonable when she finally acted. She probably thought I was too distracted by grief, too busy raising 2 kids alone, too trusting to notice the slow shifts. And maybe I had been. But lying in that hospital bed, hearing her talk about Jake finally getting the space he deserved, I understood that this wasn't just opportunism. It was calculated, and that made my resolve even sharper. Because if she thought I was going to come home weak, grateful for her help, and willing to let my children live in a cold, damp basement while her sons sprawled out in their rooms, she had no idea who she was dealing with. What she didn't know yet, what no one in that house knew, was that I was already thinking ahead. I wasn't just going to put things back the way they were. I was going to make sure she understood the cost of crossing me. And when I was done, she wouldn't just lose those upstairs rooms. She'd lose far more than she imagined possible. That night, while Melissa slept soundly upstairs in the room that used to belong to my son, I sat on the edge of the basement caught with my phone in my hand, the faint hum of the small space heater barely masking the sound of my kids breathing softly beside me. My face remained neutral, my voice steady, but inside, I was already setting the wheels in motion. I dialed my lawyer, a man I trusted with more than just legal matters, someone who knew my late husband and understood that my silence did not mean surrender. He answered on the second ring, his tone instantly alert when he heard my voice. I gave him a brief account, careful with my words, each detail sharp and deliberate. "We move tomorrow," I told him, "and I want every action to be airtight." The next morning, I got the kids ready for school, smiling and hugging them as though nothing had changed. Melissa didn't notice the difference in my movements, the way I scanned the walls, the carpet, the furniture she had shoved into my children's rooms. I made mental notes of every replacement she had installed, every personal item of theirs she had discarded. After dropping the kids off, I doubled back home, camera in hand. I took hundreds of photographs, close-ups of the chipped paint in the basement where their beds now pressed against cold cement walls, wide shots showing the lack of natural light, and every inch of their warm, colorful upstairs bedrooms now plastered with Jake's sports posters and brand new gaming setup. Every click of the shutter felt like an act of preservation, not just of evidence but of my resolve. By late afternoon, I was sitting in my best friend Laura's kitchen, sipping tea and watching her face change from disbelief to fury as I recounted what had happened. She didn't hesitate. "You and the kids are staying here as long as you need," she said, already pulling out spare blankets. It was exactly what I needed, a safe space to regroup and plan without Melissa's prying eyes. That night, while my kids giggled with Laura's 2 daughters in the next room, I called the landlord. Melissa had no idea the house wasn't fully mine. She had always assumed I owned it outright after my husband passed. In reality, I shared the title with my late husband's cousin, Tom, and Tom had made it clear that as long as I wanted, Melissa's stay was a courtesy, not a right. I explained everything to him in measured detail. He was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "If she's making the house unsafe or uncomfortable for you and the kids, we have grounds to act." That was all I needed to hear. I spent the next 2 days in quiet, methodical preparation. Every important document was already safe in a locked cabinet in my lawyer's office, beyond Melissa's reach. But now I began drafting a timeline, a full account of her behavior before and during my hospitalization, every message she ignored from me, every lie she told my kids to keep them away. I pulled phone records, text threads, and even dug out an old recording I'd made weeks before my surgery when she'd offhandedly said, "Jake's too old to be stuck downstairs. He needs those rooms." At the time, It had seemed like an idle complaint, now it was proof of intent. In between, I kept my demeanor exactly the same when I saw her. At dinner, I'd ask how her day was. I'd smile when Jake bragged about his new space. I even complimented the paint job she'd chosen for the walls, a pale blue that she was clearly proud of. All the while, I was pulling strings behind the curtain. My lawyer drafted a notice of eviction under Tom's co-ownership authority. We scheduled the official delivery for a date that just happened to coincide with a weekend when Melissa had planned a big gathering at the house. I imagined it already, her friends arriving, expecting laughter and wine, only to be greeted by a uniformed officer handing her a manila envelope with her name in bold letters. But I didn't rush. Revenge, I knew, was far more satisfying when it was deliberate. On the third night at Laura's, after tucking the kids into their borrowed beds, I sat by the window with my phone and reread a message from my lawyer. Everything is set. The notice will be served Saturday at 2 p.m. My hand rested on the armrest, steady, my breathing calm. She thought she had the upper hand because she acted while I was vulnerable. She thought stripping my children of their comfort would weaken me. But she had forgotten one thing. I had learned long ago that power doesn't come from loud threats or impulsive moves. Comes from patience. And I was ready to be very, very patient. What happens next will make you question everyone you trust. Subscribe now, drop a like, and keep listening. You don't want to miss the turn this takes. When I woke up that morning, there was no trace of hesitation left in me. My mind was set, my heart was steady, and every move I was about to make was deliberate. I had already spoken to my lawyer, every document was ready, and every detail of the plan had been mapped out to the second. By mid-morning, I stood on my porch, phone in hand, recording. The knock on the door was sharp, authoritative. Melissa opened it, expecting maybe a delivery, maybe a neighbor. Instead, she froze at the sight of the man holding a folded set of papers. He read her name aloud, then handed her the envelope. She frowned, confused, then began to read. Her face changed in stages: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally fury. "What is this?" she snapped, her voice climbing. "An eviction notice," I said calmly from behind my phone, making sure to capture every second. "Effective immediately." She laughed, that mocking, arrogant laugh she had perfected over the years. "You can't evict me. My brother left this house to his family. I am family." And that was when I let the truth drop like a hammer. "Your brother left this house to me in his will, which means you've been living here at my mercy this whole time." The shock was instant. Her smugness vanished. "You're lying," she muttered, but there was no conviction behind it. I took out a certified copy of the will from my bag, unfolded it slowly, and held it out for her. She didn't take it, but her eyes darted to the bold lettering and my name printed clearly on the page. Her mouth opened, but before she could speak, I motioned to the movers who had been waiting discreetly down the street. They rolled up in 2 large trucks, their work boots hitting the pavement in unison. Melissa's head whipped toward them, panic flashing across her face. "What are you doing?" she shouted. "Removing your belongings," I replied simply. "You can choose to pack them yourself or let the movers do it. Either way, you're leaving today." She started yelling, about rights, about family, about how I was heartless, but none of it mattered anymore. I kept recording. Every scream, every insult, every desperate plea. I knew I'd need this later. As her boxes piled up on the curb, I brought out the second part of my plan. I had called in an environmental inspector the day before to evaluate the basement. His report, now in my hand, was damning: severe black mold infestation, completely unfit for children to live in. The irony was delicious. By moving my kids down there, Melissa hadn't just shown cruelty, she had endangered their health. I handed her a copy. "You put my children's safety at risk," I said, my voice steady but sharp enough to cut. "And I have medical proof that the dampness made them sick. You'll be hearing from my lawyer again soon." Her rage broke into something else then: fear. She knew exactly what that meant. Not just eviction. Court. Maybe even a record. And worst of all for someone like her, her reputation shredded beyond repair. By the afternoon, the neighborhood had gathered in small clusters on the sidewalks, whispering. Everyone saw her things being hauled out. Everyone saw her standing there, red-faced and trembling, trying to maintain dignity and failing miserably. I didn't have to say a word. The scene spoke for itself. As the last box was loaded, I walked over to her. "Melissa," I said softly so only she could hear. "You wanted my kids in the basement. Now you'll have to find one of your own." Her eyes filled with pure hatred, but there was nothing she could do. She climbed into her car and drove away, speeding, tires squealing. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with messages from family members. Some pretended they had no idea she had done this. Others tried to guilt me, saying I'd gone too far. But those were the same people who had watched her belittle me for years and stayed silent. I ignored them all. Within a week, the whispers had turned into full-blown stories. Some said she had been kicked out for stealing. Others said she had abused my kids. I didn't have to correct them. The truth was out there, and the damage to her image was permanent. My kids and I moved back into our real rooms that night, their laughter echoing off the freshly painted walls that no longer felt tainted. Every photograph I had taken, every document I had kept, and every careful move I had made had led to this moment. Melissa thought she had cornered me during my weakest time. But she underestimated the one thing that had always kept me standing. I might bend under pressure, but I don't break. And in the end, I didn't just take back my home. I took back my peace. When the dust settled, I finally saw the relief in my children's faces. No more waking up shivering under thin blankets. No more sleeping with the faint smell of mildew clinging to their clothes. In our new temporary place, a small sunlit apartment owned by my best friend's cousin, my kids moved around freely, their laughter echoing off the walls like it used to. For the first time in weeks, they were smiling without forcing it. I didn't care that the kitchen was tiny, or that I had to share a dresser with my youngest. What mattered was that they were safe, warm, and treated with dignity. Melissa, on the other hand, was a different story. Word traveled quickly in our family and the neighborhood. The once loud and overbearing woman who strutted into my life with her nose in the air, was now moving her things into a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Jake, the boy who deserved the best rooms in my house, now shared a space so small his bed touched the wall on both sides. I didn't gloat, not outwardly. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a certain satisfaction in knowing that every box she carried, every step up those narrow stairs, was a reminder of what her greed had cost her. I had seen people destroy themselves before, but never with such efficiency. Melissa's downfall wasn't because I shouted, or fought, or stooped to her level. It was because I stood still and let her walk straight into her own trap. She had wanted control, comfort, and dominance. Instead, she walked away with none of them. Looking back, I realized she never really saw me. She thought I was soft. She mistook kindness for weakness. But what she didn't understand was that I'd been through storms much harsher than her petty games. Losing my husband had taught me that pain, when endured quietly, could turn into an unstoppable kind of strength. Sometimes, revenge doesn't come with fireworks or grand speeches. Sometimes it's served in the quiet moment when you shut your own front door, and know the person who wronged you will never walk through it again. Melissa thought taking 2 rooms would make her son's life better. Instead, she lost the roof over their heads. And in the end, I didn't have to raise my voice or lose my dignity to get justice. I tucked my kids in that night, watching their chests rise and fall in peaceful sleep. My eldest had one arm hanging over the bed, a soft smile on her lips. My youngest had snuggled so deep into his blanket, he was barely visible. I sat there for a while, memorizing their faces. That was the moment I knew every ounce of patience, every silent hour I'd spent biting my tongue, had been worth it. People often think the strongest weapon is rage, but I learned that patience, sharp, deliberate, and quiet, cuts far deeper. And as I turned off the lights, I promised myself one thing: never again would I let someone walk into our lives thinking they could take what wasn't theirs. Because I had waited once, and I had won. And if I ever needed to, I could wait again. A few weeks later, when life had begun to settle into its new rhythm, I found myself sitting at the dining table of our temporary apartment, sorting through old files. My husband's handwriting caught my eye, familiar, strong strokes on the corner of an envelope I'd kept tucked away since the funeral. Inside was a letter he had written years before, after our first child was born. In it, he spoke about the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind, not just for our family, but for the community. He believed that helping children who had nothing was the truest way to honor the life we had been blessed with. I thought about Melissa then, about the endless arguments over money, The subtle digs about how I managed our finances, her fixation on squeezing every last benefit she could from me under the guise of family duty, and suddenly, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. The next morning, I walked into a local children's shelter. The place was warm but worn, the kind of place that ran on love, but could have used twice the funding it had. I met the director, a woman whose eyes carried both exhaustion and hope. She told me about the kids, many abandoned, some neglected, all of them craving the stability they'd been denied. I wrote the check on the spot, the same amount Melissa had been pressing me for, the same number she had once mocked me for being too stingy to part with. But instead of it ending up in her hands, it would put new mattresses in those kids' rooms. It would fill their shelves with books. It would buy warm coats for winter. And it would be done in my husband's name, etched on a plaque by the front door so every child who walked in would see his legacy, not hers. When I handed over the check, I felt something lift off my shoulders. This wasn't about charity, it was about taking back control, about turning what she tried to take from me into something that would grow beyond her reach. She had wanted to drain me. Instead, I'd chosen to pour into something that could never be corrupted by her greed. As I left the shelter, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The real victory wasn't in Melissa's loss, it was in my gain. I had taken back my power without shouting, without public scenes, without lowering myself to her level. I had simply redirected the energy. And in doing so, I'd built something that would outlast both of us. And that was how I took back my power without raising my voice. If this ending gave you chills, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell so you never miss a story like this, and drop a comment telling me what part made your heart race the most. Because trust me, there's more where this came from.